Good afternoon, and welcome to City Club of Portland Friday Forum. I am John Horvick, City Club President, and I'd like to welcome members and guests alike, those of you who join us today at the Governor Hotel, and those of you listening on OPB Radio or watching on Portland Community Media. Today, we will discuss the future of investigative reporting, but first, some announcements. The generous support of City Club's corporate and media partners ensures we put on the state's best programs week after week. I'd like to thank our media partners, including Oregon Business Magazine. Our current Friday Forum sponsors are Geffen Mesher, Iberdrola Renewables, Perkins Coie, Portland General Electric, and Providence Health and Services. Today's program is also co-sponsored by the University of Oregon George S. Turnbull Center in Portland. We are grateful for your support and commitment to City Club's mission. Please join me in a warm round of applause for all of them. Next Friday, we will tell the tale of two cities, Portland and Detroit. Our speakers will be Sandy Barua, President and CEO of the Detroit Regional Chamber, and Sandy McDonough, President and CEO of the Portland Business Alliance. On Thursday, November 7th, our member-led forum committee is hosting a free event with Andrea Durbin, Executive Director of the Oregon Environmental Council, and State Representative Alyssa Kenny-Geyer, that will explore toxins in our daily lives. You can learn more about these and other club events, purchase tickets, and become a member on our website, pdxcityclub.org. As always, City Club will be live tweeting at today's event. You can follow or mention us at pdxcityclub, and be sure to use the hashtag CityClub in your own tweets. We'll be having a Q&A session with our guests at the end of today's program. Members, please come to the microphone to ask your question. And for all our audience participants, please locate the index cards on the center of your tables and write your questions on them during the forum. We'll collect them prior to the start of the Q&A. And now to our program. The kind of in-depth reporting that sheds light on issues, drives discussion, and exposes injustice may be in short supply, with the traditional economic models for newspapers broken. Today, we will explore this issue in ways to preserve and promote a robust press here in Portland and across Oregon. Steve Duin, columnist for the Oregonian, has won many honors, including an award for National Journalism Honor Society, Sigma Delta Chi. Steve is a graduate of Wake Forest University with a master's in English. He has authored or co-authored 6 books, including Comics Between the Panels, A History of Comics, Father Time, a collection of his columns on family and fatherhood, and a graphic novel, Oil and Water, which chronicles a trip of 24 Oregonians to the Gulf Coast to lend helping hands in the aftermath of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Nigel Jaquiss took an unlikely path to investigative reporting. After graduating from Dartmouth, he spent 11 years as a Wall Street and Singapore-based crude oil trader, working for Cargill, Morgan Stanley, and Goldman Sachs. Seeking a career change, he enrolled in Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism and received a master's degree in 1997 before joining Willamette Week 15 years ago. He has won local and regional awards, as well as the big one, the 2005 Pulitzer Prize for Investigative Reporting. Eve Epstein is Director of News and Public Affairs at OPB, where she helped create the daily call-in program Think Out Loud. Eve served as print reporter in West Virginia and Boston, covering religion, education, presidential politics, hurricanes, and other major stories, before moving to public radio as news editor for WBUR in Boston. She then became the senior news editor in Los Angeles for public radio's Marketplace before arriving in Oregon in 1998. She has a master's degree in journalism from Columbia University and a BA from Princeton University, where she majored in comparative literature. She was lead producer for the OPB's Peabody Award-winning series, Hard Times. And so without further ado, please join me in welcoming today's presenters to the stage.
Well, John, I want to thank you so much for that introduction, for all of us. We're going to read a few opening thoughts, I think, to get us started, and then we're going to have a discussion. And I'm going to move my chair so that I can actually see both of you. First of all, thank you so much for inviting us here today. And it's a pleasure to talk about a subject that's near and dear to all our hearts, I'm sure. I thought I'd start, since the title of the panel discussion is The Future of Investigative Journalism, with a fun and interesting exercise, and that is to look back at an iconic piece of investigative journalism that we're all familiar with, Watergate, and imagine how it might play out in the digital era. Let's start with the break-in itself. Does anybody really think that burglars, political operatives, would break in physically to an opponent's headquarters in this day and age? They might want to gather some laptops, but really they'd probably want to break into the database, hack into it to get the information that they needed. And how would they pay off the burglars or launch a cover-up? Would it be with checks? Would they be using anything other than the computer to do that? On the other side of things, how easy would it be today for Woodward and Bernstein to follow the money? Would they be looking for checks? Would they be looking for physical evidence? Does anybody think that they would follow the money in that way? Following the money today is a really complex proposition. Just think about the LIBOR scandal that recently broke, where the traders are accused of using small margins to manipulate trades and to make millions in that way. Surely, instead of tracking down tape recordings with 18-minute gaps, reporters would be looking for email trails. Would they use social media to find sources? Would they meet sources physically or just text them or friend them? And who'd be covering the story? Would it break in a newspaper or online in a blog? And would Deep Throat really bother to get in touch with a reporter at all? Or would he just hand his documents over to WikiLeaks? Of course, one of the great things about doing research today when you're giving a fanciful talk about Watergate in the digital era is that all you have to do is Google Watergate in the digital era to find out that indeed Woodward and Bernstein weighed in on the subject just last year. And the one thing that they both stressed is that you can't discount the human factor, the importance of interviews with sources. They told young journalists that you can't just do everything required of a great investigative reporter by doing it on a computer. And so you need people, reporters that is, to get the human intelligence. And in that light, here's a very striking statistic. A former newspaper reporter who's been tabulating layoffs and buyouts in the industry estimates that more than 42,000 people have been laid off in journalism between 2007 and 2012 nationwide. So that's where we are today, writ large. We're smack in the midst of a digital era that has been shrinking the pool of journalists available to cover stories. It provided us, by the way, with incredible tools for telling those stories. And it's also provided those who wish to manipulate data and to break the law to indulge in corruption in brand new ways. So with that, I want to turn it to my colleagues here for their opening thoughts as well.
Hey, thanks for coming today. I went earlier this week to the opening game of the World Series. I got a text from my son in Los Angeles asking me, I don't suppose you want to catch a red eye and catch the Red Sox in Boston for the first game of the series. Like most of you, that's not an invitation you turn down. And it wasn't until I got to Fenway Park that I reflected for a moment on the last time that I was there for a baseball game. It was 27 years to the day, Game 5 of the 1986 World Series. At that point, my son was 16 months old, and my wife was at home with him and not amused by my absence. And of course, her experience was anytime I covered a playoff series as a sports columnist, the series went 7 games. Relax, I told her. The Red Sox are starting Clemens Saturday night at Shea. Bill Buckner is a vacuum cleaner at first base. You have nothing to worry about. I'm writing about that experience for the Sunday newspaper and the Friday night website. And as I was sitting with the bound volume from 1986, about the columns that I wrote from that series, Ken Go, who's been at the Oregonian almost as long as I have, came by and looked at the page opposite the sports front from that October 1986 paper and said, "Wow, classified ads." And he said that with the sense of wonder and incredulity that we normally reserve in Oregon for Republicans in statewide office. In 1986, as a 32-year-old sports columnist, I not only covered the World Series, but the Final Four, the NBA playoffs, and Jack Nicklaus's fifth Masters victory at Augusta. There wasn't an Oregon team or personality anywhere in sight, and it didn't matter. In those days when we were chasing stories, the sports editor, as we like to say, gave me a pile of money and a match and said, burn as much as you need. In those days, Republican Vicatia was governor, and we were bankrolled by the classified ads. A lot has changed since then in the medium, the market, and the matches. Long gone are classified ads, a subscription base with limited options on where they get their morning news, and 32-year-olds who can count on a career in this business. What endures and remains? More than you think. The future of investigative reporting? The question unnerves me too, but only because I care about it so much, and not because I doubt the Oregonians or Oregon Public Broadcasting and Willamette Week's commitment to it.
I wish I'd been at the World Series earlier this week. So I want to talk a little bit about the reality of investigative reporting. A lot of people, I think, would trace the modern era of investigative reporting to the Watergate break-in and to the movie that was made about it, All the President's Men, which was made in 1976, and I think brought a whole generation of people who might not have otherwise been interested in journalism into reporting, and many of them wanted to become investigative reporters and hoped that they would, in that process, come to look like Robert Redford. And I can tell you that the practice, at least today, is far less glamorous than the reporting that's portrayed in that movie. The metaphor that I thought of when I was asked to join this panel was the Portland Marathon, which was going on around the time that City Club contacted me, and I thought that being an investigative reporter today is a little bit like being an ant who signed up to run in the marathon alongside 10,000 human beings. So you're down there at the bottom. Your survival is highly questionable. You can't see anything, and you have a complete lack of perspective. And I think that's where many of the people in this room are, journalists and non-journalists alike. It's very difficult to see the future. All we know is that the Oregonian used to be a lot thicker than it is today. Willamette Week used to have a lot more pages. Everybody in the local media world used to have more time and more resources to chase big stories, to do investigative reporting. And so that can feel, both as a reporter and as a reader, depressing. And I think that rather than be depressed, we should look around us. Sometimes we have to look nationally to see what's happening in the larger scheme of things. And I think there are a couple of things before we delve into how bad things may be in Portland, a couple of things to be pretty optimistic about. And I, as anybody who knows me, I'm not an optimist by nature. But you've seen in the past 6 months two really smart investors, John Henry, who happens to own the Boston Red Sox, a longtime commodity trader, buy the Boston Globe, and you've seen Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, buy the Washington Post. Now that matters a lot to me because both of those guys made a lot of money by being better thinkers than those people around them. The second part of it that should matter a lot to all of you is that they bought those newspapers for cash. We've seen a lot of newspapers in the past 2 decades be bought, either taken public or be bought by people who are using borrowed money. So the premise when you buy something with borrowed money is that you're going to starve it and you're going to squeeze all the cash you can out of it. When you buy something for cash, when you put equity into the transaction as Bezos and John Henry did, it's a different scenario entirely. So I think we should feel optimistic that the days of leveraged buyout artists like Sam Zell coming into the newspaper business are probably over. The second thing that makes me feel optimistic is that there are publications in this country that are really thriving. The Financial Times, The Economist, the Bloomberg suite of publications are all actually expanding. They're gaining market share. They're able to sell their product for more money than they could sell it for a year or two ago. That tells me there remains a real demand for high-quality journalism. So, you know, it does sometimes feel as if I'm an ant surrounded by big people and about to get crushed, but larger perspective, I think, is not quite so gloomy.
And I like your aunt's point of view perspective, and I wonder if that's a starting place for us, because I agree, it feels sometimes as though we're working away in our own little worlds. But from our day-to-day perspective as journalists, how has what you do, and you've both been doing it for long enough to have, I think, a good perspective on what's changed so far, how has what you do day-to-day changed, and what has not changed? Steve?
Well, not enough of what I need to do day to day has changed. I still look at my column as sort of the legacy piece. It is the legacy piece of what I do, but the demands of the business now require that you do things much more often and you pay attention to a lot more things. We're assuming that our audience, I mean, we used to be in a 24-hour business. Now we're in a 24-minute business, or excuse me, 24-second business possibly. When I was covering sports many, many moons ago, you could luxuriate knowing that everyone was going to read what you did in the morning. You don't have that luxury. You have to turn things over much more quickly. You have to pay attention to far many more things. You have to find ways to bring people to the digital embodiment of the Oregonian all the time. So there is I suppose, a restlessness and a frantic nature of the job that a curmudgeon columnist like me is taking a little bit of time getting used to.
Nigel?
So Steve has covered the downside of, I think we're like hamsters on a wheel, and we're continually producing, which means you have less time to spend pursuing larger, longer-term stories. So that can be tough. Here's the good side of what's different about the job for me over the past 15 years is that a lot of investigative reporting relies on public records in addition to shoe leather reporting and human source interviews. And I have to say that even though I'm a technical Luddite, the ability to seek out and find public records is immeasurably easier. I think for a small paper like Willamette Week, it's really helped us enormously to be able to find things like campaign finance reports online, to be able to find court records online, to be able to find a lot of government documents that you used to have to go down to Salem to get, or to go to out to a county 200 miles from here to get. To find them online is a much, much better thing.
Does that mean you get out of the office less, though? That you're doing more work on a computer at your desk? Is there a downside to that at all?
It means I get out perhaps less, but it's still the case that you can't do any real reporting without talking to people, and that people will always tell you more in person than they will on the phone. So I get out as much as I can.
And I'd say from the Oregon Public Broadcasting perspective in our newsroom, one of the changes I've seen is that we have people now who are thinking in multimedia terms. We've always had a television side and a radio side. We're a little less familiar, actually, with print. But we now are always thinking, and as an editor, we're always trying to think about what are the various ways we need to tell this story. I come from a background that includes the wire service, so I used to write quite a few stories a day as a wire reporter, and I think our motto was a deadline every minute at some point. And in public broadcasting, we take a look at different slices of things we want to choose. We need to pick and choose what it is that we want to focus on for the day. What is the most important story of the day? But I have to watch a lot more things as an editor to see what's going on and to make those kinds of decisions. I have a tweet deck open on my one of my screens. I don't use that at all as a primary source. It's solely to know what's going on. It's like a headline service for me. I wonder if you could both talk about the role of editors and where you think the question about what material is getting out there these days that you're competing with when it comes to material that's been edited and that hasn't, and how the role of editors may have changed in your newsroom.
Well, my editors are here, so I need to be incredibly careful about that. Well, again, there is so much going on that your editors maintain a little bit of aesthetic distance from what everyone, from the circus that's out there in the newsroom now, and just are helping to choreograph it, directing you, as I think they have always done, to the stuff that matters. From the very beginning, I think what Nigel and I trust you too, Eve, have always wanted to do is, what are people in town talking about? What matters? How do we reflect on it thoughtfully? How do we advance the story so they have a little bit more information than they did when the television station was reading the last thing that we wrote on the air, and the editors are there helping us, again, come to a more mature understanding of how we have to keep pushing things forward. So I don't know that their function has changed dramatically in this new world order.
But I want to focus in on something that you said about and I agree with you. The dream is, what are people talking about? And presumably in this world with Facebook and Twitter, we know what people are talking about, or do we?
Well, I think last night we broke a story about the new director of the OLCC having been arrested for a DUI in 2010, and somebody sent me an email and said, I thought everybody knew that. And I thought to myself, well, everybody may have known that, but you have to, as a reporter, be able to write something that an editor will actually let you publish. So there's an enormous difference between what people think they know and what is actually true. And I think perhaps one of the least understood aspects of reporting or investigative reporting is that the crucial role that an editor plays in being a gatekeeper to stop information that is either not true or not fully vetted from appearing. And so people say, well, I get my information from the internet, or I get my information from Twitter or Facebook. And in my view, and maybe this is a self-serving view, there's a lot of unmediated garbage available, and people are not well served if they're getting their news from Twitter because nobody edits Twitter. They're often not well served from getting news from Facebook because nobody edits what goes onto Facebook. And so all reporters complain bitterly about editors, but editors actually provide a massive public service. And so, I think one of the things that is lost when you boot up your computer and start looking at things is you don't think about how it got to you, and that's the problem as we see revenue disappear from this business. Is there's less of it to pay people to make sure the information you read is accurate.
I have to say I'm basking in the glow as an editor who has long heard the words of Edna Buchanan, famous investigative reporter, who said, never trust an editor, never trust an editor, never trust an editor. So thank you very much. We have had examples, of course, on Twitter with breaking news stories in Boston, the bombing case, and in other instances where there have been people wrongly accused, or leads that have panned out in Twitter that turned out not to be true. And in some cases, where mainstream journalists have kind of followed along. Have you discussed that in your newsrooms and come up with plans now to make sure that you don't follow the pack, as it were?
Yeah, I think that goes without saying. I mean, I don't think the standards, I think the standards and ethics in the in the business of producing content are changing. There are so many alternative news sources out there now who can produce things a little quicker than we do because they don't care or want to take as much care as we do in producing content. So I think our standards I don't think have changed. I think our timeline has changed a little bit, but our standards haven't. And I think we're very conscious of how much bad information is out there, and that people still turn to the Oregonian, as I think they turn to Willamette Week and OPB, because they want to trust in the accuracy of the information they're getting.
It is, again, I don't want to say that Twitter is not useful or other sources of information are not useful. I think it's always helpful to have competition and pressure. And I think the Portland readers are well served by having OPB and the Oregonian and Willamette Week and the Tribune and the Business Journal and other voices all trying to be first on an important story. But I think that you can see a clear differential between publications that have libel insurance and worry about getting sued and have trained professional journalists who have the professional pride of not wanting to make fools of themselves. That's still a big difference, and I think it matters to people.
And you were you were the first Pulitzer Prize winning reporter to win a prize whose story got posted online first. Was that a conscious decision at the time, or was competition part of that decision in making that published online
Sure,
first?
that was 2004 when our website, which most people today would say is still not very good, was even worse. And yes, it was absolutely all about competition, not to rehash old history, but I'd spent a long time on this story, and we were ready to publish our once-a-week print version, and we got information that the Oregonian had jumped on the story and was ready to publish the next day. And so my story was all done, but it wasn't going to be printed for several days, so we threw some of it and most of it up on our website.
And I have to say, I grew up in a two-newspaper town. I started working as a reporter in a two-newspaper town. And I know that I became a better reporter because I was aware every single day that the other reporter who covered City Hall was going to beat me if I didn't get a great story on my own. In fact, our newspaper had not endorsed the sitting mayor, and so the mayor tended to hand press releases to the other reporter all the time. But it really made me have to dig and to find stories that otherwise I wouldn't have found. So I do appreciate the importance of competition, but I wonder if in this new era there's also a role for collaboration between news organizations. ProPublica is obviously an outstanding example of an investigative entity that has partnered with news organizations to do their work. Do you think there's a role for collaboration in furthering what we all want to do?
I sure hope so. And I think we've seen, I mean, you're talking about ProPublica. ProPublica is an example of, again, I suppose, an alternative way of looking at the news. There are some great investigative machines out there now that didn't exist 10 years ago. Texas Tribune, Center for Investigative Reporting in Berkeley, Center for Investigative, I think, Integrity, something like that in DC. And these groups are doing amazing work. I think it's a little harder to imagine something like that in Oregon. Ryan Frank, who used to work at the Oregonian and then went down to become publisher of the Emerald at the University of Oregon, has been basically tried for a year to come up with a collaborative enterprise such as that. Approached every major news organization in the state, and a lot of entrepreneurs in the state looking for $300,000 in funding so he could come up with a three-man operation that would focus on investigative reporting. And in a state like Oregon, it's very, very difficult to do that. The fundraising is debilitating at best. So I hope there's more of a future for that sort of effort for people who are absolutely committed to the best part of our business.
I think that almost everybody who's ever written a story about a utility or another monopoly or edited that story thinks to himself, God, I hate monopolies. They're lazy, they promote inefficiency, and they're just bad for consumers. And I think, unfortunately, we in the media in the print media had a monopoly for a very long time. And so instead of more collaboration, I actually think that we would be served, the readers of this city and this state would be served by more competition. I think that we got fat and lazy on classified ads and display ads and other kinds of ads that have now migrated to more efficient electronic homes. And so I think that what readers want is they want to know what's happening and why it's happening. And so they don't want to see Steve Duin and me with our arms around each other saying, gee, how can we work together? They want to see us beating each other's brains out to try and get a better, faster, more interesting, more relevant story. So I think, I hope we'll go in the direction of, you know, newspaper wars, friendly wars, but newspaper wars, wars with OPB, wars with KGW and K2, not because I'm a war-loving person, but because I think the public is served by more people chasing more stories harder.
I will say that OPB has had quite a bit of success collaborating with some of our competitors, even other stations. We have launched a couple of efforts to create regional news services. One of them is our N3 partnership, which is a regional partnership with other news stations. They have 5 reporters, and there's an editor who's based at OPB, though he could be based anywhere in the region. And those reporters, we air those reporters' stories. We also share stories with other stations that their reporters do. The more recent collaboration that we've had is called Earthfix, and it's our environmental team. It's a multimedia team, again, regionally based reporters who cover the environment, and an investigative reporter is a part of that team. And we just started a new partnership with newspapers in the state to share content as well, to share information. And at the moment, it's a content sharing kind of partnership, but I think there are possibly opportunities to explore ways that we might do stories together. We haven't gone down that road yet. But I want to push back a little bit, Nigel, on you and say, as I said, I agree, having grown up and cut my teeth as a reporter in a 2-newspaper town, that competition is a good thing for the community. But I wonder, with the impact question that you talked a little bit about, Steve, that when your column comes out or when the story comes out these days, it doesn't necessarily land the way it did years ago. Would there be the opportunity for you two to work together? I mean, you'd be a great team, I gotta say, on a story down the road where we could agree that for the sake of the community, this is an important story. If we do it together, we'll do it better than if we do it alone. Competition the rest of the year, but 1 or 2 stories a year that we think are very important, we should work together on them and find a way to do that.
I can tell you that we at Willamette Week would be very happy to have Steve join our newsroom. And no, I think that you do see that. First of all, let me back up because my last comment was somewhat inane and say that I think the Oregonian works collaboratively with KGW as we do with K2, and I think when media organizations work in different media, then collaboration makes a lot of sense. But let's say there's a story at City Hall or in the Capitol. I think where the media actually does a good job is when the Oregonian breaks a story and somebody else follows it, or we break a story and they follow it. Then you have journalists rushing to advance a story. If we're working together, you take away all the immediacy and all the tension and all the fear of being beaten. And I think that that can have negative outcomes, those fears and that tension, but I think it more often has a positive, motivating sort of influence on reporters.
No, there's no chance that Nigel and I will ever work together on anything, but that said, there's few people in town whose reporting gifts I admire more than his. And one of the reasons for that is I recognize the difference between stories that are easy to write and stories that are very, very difficult to write. So I realize the work product that goes into what he does. You know, again, some things are easy to do. Multnomah County is easy to cover for us. Jackson County is hard. Outrage is easy. Comedy is hard. Politics are easy to cover. Business is hard. Anniversary stories are easy. Investigative reporting is time-consuming and difficult. You know, it took Steve Suo on our staff, I think, 20 months to come up to finish his series on meth. It took Brian Denson and Les Zeitz 18 months to expose the Fed's scandal-plagued work programs for the disabled. It took Jeff Manning and Jim Long, 14 months to complete the investigation into Jeff Grayson and Andy Wiederhorn. These things take a great deal of time to cultivate sources, to run down the people who don't want to talk to you the first time you call, even if they know if they have the truth inside them and it's trying to get out. This stuff takes time, and one of the dilemmas in our business, I think, right now is to find out ways to finance part of the business that doesn't pay for itself. We have to finance something on a daily and weekly basis so we can pay for the investigative work that takes literally years to put together.
So I want to get to the question of ownership in that case, because you brought up some of the new owners of journalistic properties, and there's another one now in the ring, and that's Pierre Omidyar, and I hope I pronounced that correctly, who also comes out of the digital world. Again, in the old days, the first newspaper I worked at was a family-owned newspaper. The publisher who owned it was at the newspaper every day. I knew who he was. He had a stake in that community. Do you think that these new owners are going to bring the kind of editorial standards, commitment to community, or commitment to what they're doing to the table that really sets the tone, I think, for any newsroom?
I think that's impossible for us to know. What it is easy to see is that somebody that has the wealth of a Jeff Bezos or of a John Henry is presented with very attractive investment opportunities all the time. Those guys are both numbers guys. They know what they're getting into. And you could look at Warren Buffett, who has been a newspaper owner for decades. People understand the economics of newspapers today, and they're buying in. I'd say that I've had the privilege to work for two guys who own Willamette Week for 15 years, and the reason that I have stayed at the paper for so long has a lot to do with local ownership, and that is not meant as an indirect dig at the Oregonian. What I mean by that is that they've bet the paper on investigative stories a couple of times since I've been there, and they've been willing to do so because they're really committed to this city and this state, and I think that is a huge benefit of local ownership and having people that buy newspapers because they're interested in producing news, not because they're interested in making money. So I have to believe, coming back to people like Bezos and John Henry, they know very well that they're getting into a business that is not particularly lucrative, and they're getting in anyway. So I think that's a very good thing.
Steve?
And I also think it's important to point out that there are some fairly creative people out there who don't seem to care about making money to produce content. I mean, we talked earlier about alternative voices, even in Oregon. You know, there's a guy down at the University of Oregon, Bill Harbaugh, who writes a blog, UO Matters, who's just a contentious pain in the ass on the faculty of the University of Oregon, but amazingly valuable in the content he provides that he doesn't care about getting compensated for. People like that are increasingly valuable, I think, to us because they, again, you love to find the folks out there who want the real story to get out. Most people are trying to sell you something, and the more people who are out there who are, again, just really think it's important that we know what the real story is, to me, that's an encouraging trend in what's going on right now.
Are you surprised that there aren't more people in that category, though? That there aren't? I mean, the great promise of citizen journalism was that the bloggers would rise up, that there would be stories uncovered that the media wouldn't uncover in other ways. Do you think that there are more people out there doing that than you would have thought, or fewer at this point in time?
I think, well, Bill Harbaugh that Steve mentioned is very valuable to reporters because he actually makes public records requests and posts public records. So he posts substantial information that we can actually rely on to be accurate. Many people who blog in this city blog opinion, and opinion is worthless to reporters. There are occasions on which those kinds of people might provide a tip or a direction, but I think it's time-consuming work to gather public records or to do real reporting where you're talking to real sources on the record who will provide useful information. So I guess I'm not surprised. I'm surprised that Bill does it, that Jack Bogdansky, who isn't blogging right now, did it for a while.
What about the time to pursue leads that don't come through at the end of the day? How much time do you have at this point to go down the road of, looking into something that doesn't pan out, which is also part of the job, I think?
Well, I'm probably balancing 5 or 10 stories like that all the time. And again, you're just waiting for them to come together. I mean, I think that's what a reporter will do. You're factoring into that all the time, the fact that 2/3 of these things are not going to come together, or even if some of them come together, do you tell that story? Is that, I guess we want to know the story of the 17 and 18-year-old kids who were in that car in Forest Grove, but some of these stories are incredibly painful, and you also have to be very aware that even as you're working on them, you may end up somewhere. You may end up in some uncomfortable places, and sometimes that story, you're not going to let it go.
I think one thing that I have noticed in the past year or two, particularly around difficult stories that when the tip comes in are just going to be hard to get and are going to take a lot of time, is I've had that sinking feeling that I'm probably not going to do this story and nobody's going to do this story. And I think that I have noticed more. It used to be the case where you'd think, well, and I've certainly said, not a story for me, call Jeff Manning, call Steve Duin, call somebody at the Oregonian. A lot of times now I know it's just not going to get done.
And is that because there aren't enough people for them to call? Or because you don't have the time, or because there's more pressure on you to get stories that are going to make it into print?
Willamette Week has always been small. At our peak, we had 5 news reporters. Today we have 3, so that's a 40% reduction in staff. I think the Oregonian has had a comparable reduction in the sort of investigative or senior reporters. There are not as many people, and more of our collective time is spent chasing daily posts for our websites.
I wonder if you could both talk a little bit about your relationship with your audience in this era, because I'm assuming that that's changed. For one thing, you see comments posted on your stories, and how has the way that the audience can communicate with you changed what you do, if at all, or changed the way you think about your stories and how they'll perform?
I think that's been a really positive thing to what's happening. People sometimes will ask me, or have often asked me, where do you get your story ideas? And I look at them like, what are you talking about? The phone rings. It rings a lot, and people are calling you, and they have something for you. And people just have many more ways now to, the word we use is engage with you. I mean, they can send you to a story, and in the comment stream, a place that I'm often uncomfortable, I might add, but in the comment stream, suddenly people are coming up, people can interact with you, engage with you, tell you things, and a lot of this used to happen behind the scenes, but they will tell you aspects of the story that you didn't know about. I mean, when I wrote the piece on Central City Concern doing a news center out in Oregon City on the site where Ashley and Miranda died, talked to Miranda's mother, did not talk to Miranda's sister, and suddenly the website provides Miranda's sister, who disagrees with my column, an opportunity to argue with me on the point. So actually, I think in terms of engaging with our audience, a heck of a lot more of that is going on, and that's pretty damn positive.
Do you read the comments, all the comments on your stories?
That is one of my new responsibilities, yes.
I would agree with Steve. I think that now that the internet is such a great thing for reader engagement, because people all over the place can read your stories, and a lot of times tips will come or comments will come often directly to the reporter, not through the comments section, adding information or correcting errors in a way that didn't happen before. But I will tell you, particularly now as political season is upon us, that there's no greater feeling than going to your mailbox and seeing a letter, a plain white envelope with nothing but your name and address on it, no return address. Got one of those yesterday, and it does feel like Christmas when those come in the mailbox.
I wonder if, while we're on the subject of audience, that in an era when, first of all, when there's a lot of opinion journalism out there, if we want to call it that, where people can listen in the echo chamber, hear what they want to hear, are there assumptions made about where you fall on the political line with your stories? Do you find yourself being categorized in one side or another in this era when more and more people are listening in the echo chamber or reading about information in the echo chamber?
Well, I think you hear people conclude all sorts of things. I mean, and I don't think you take it all that seriously or hold it against them.
I think that good reporters are equal opportunity investigators in this county because we have so many more Democrats than Republicans. A lot of our stories end up being about the misdeeds of Democrats, not because we don't like Democrats, we just don't like people that do bad things. So it's really a question, and I will say that no matter who you write about and what you say about them, people will accuse you of having bias, so it's sort of unavoidable.
I wonder if we could just wrap up with one final question. When you look out in the landscape and when you look at our community, and I don't want you to give away stories that you're working on, specific stories, but what are the general categories of story that you look at and you say, I worry for our community that we aren't going to be able to cover this?
Well, and I'm going to go back to what I said earlier. Business stories, I think especially, are incredibly difficult to do. Political stories are easy because you have obviously people on both sides of the political aisle who are feeding you unbelievable material. I think the nonprofit world, the business world, the corporate world is incredibly complex. It's tough for us to get our arms around. No one is helping us. It does not serve them for us to tell their story. Those stories are tough. They're going to remain very difficult to get a hold of.
If I were to critique my own work or Steve's work, I think that reporters are drawn to writing about the intersection of public policy and private interest in money and power, in topics that are sexy. And so I think that we have always shorted really important issues like poverty. You know, you look around this country, you look around this state and say, why are people still poor when we have so much wealth in this country? It's a really interesting question, but not a sexy field of inquiry, especially if your editor has a short attention span. So we're not doing enough about poverty. We're not doing enough about mental illness. We're not doing enough about issues that are unsexy, that are really important, that cost a whole lot of money to deal with, but don't make people happy. They don't make people smile. They don't make people even outraged.
And I would agree that certainly the decline of the middle class, poverty, those are all issues I look at and I go, we've got to figure out a way to do a better job telling that story. I would only add that climate change is another story that I think is a very important story, and we have to figure out how to tell it well. So with that, I want to thank you very much, and I think it's time for your questions.
Indeed it is. And now if you have a written question on an index card, please hold it up high so City Club staff can collect it from you. We'll now take questions from the floor. As always, we invite members to the microphone to ask their question. Asking questions at the Friday Forum microphone is a benefit of City Club membership, and membership is open to everyone. Before asking your question, identify yourself as a City Club member. Please only ask one question and ask your question as succinctly as possible. If I flash this question mark, it means please try to wrap it up.
Greg McPherson, City Club member. Serious journalism has all but disappeared from the broadcast media of radio and television, with the notable exception of OPB. Why is it that journalistic standards are holding up better in newspapers than they are in the radio and television markets?
You want to?
Well, I think it's the nature of the medium. I think that when you sit down with a newspaper, as many of us in this room still like to do, it's a long, considered approach where you may not know what you're looking for until you find it. And I think that people who run newspapers understand that they want to provide a variety of reader experiences, many of which are not visual, are not oral, and are just more thoughtful in nature.
And I guess I'd only add that television's very expensive, and that in the cable era, when you're dividing your audience along much thinner slices of the pie, that the pressures on television news, frankly, to make money are that much more.
Edward Hershey, City Club member. This week in Virginia, an Associated Press reporter and editor, two respected journalists, were fired for moving too quickly on an investigative story about the governor's race there. Is there a possibility, if not a threat, that the reduced time and reduced staff that you have all talked about are likely to put you in a situation where you will want to move too quickly on stories that need more time?
Yeah. Especially because somebody else is moving at that pace all the time. And their presence on the internet may not be as significant as yours, but you know, if you follow Twitter, and I would recommend you all do it, as if nothing else is a news feed, it's absolutely marvelous. You know, when you get these Twitter storms, they're hours ahead of generally, especially, you know, used to watch broadcast television to sort of get up to the minute, sort of a sense of what was going on, and Twitter is so far ahead of television now, much less your average website. So, but yeah, the threat is that gut-clenching threat is always there, and I don't want to think about it anymore, to tell you the truth.
I would just say that in public radio, we always say that we'd rather get it right than be first. But having said that, we're often on the front lines of live broadcasts as they're unfolding. And you know what we say in our newsroom over and over again is, say what you know. Don't give in to the temptation to say something that you don't know or that hasn't been confirmed.
Steve Novick, City Club member. Game 7 of the 1986 World Series had a 55% audience share, and the series as a whole had a nearly 30% share. Last year's series had a 12% share. We used to come together as a nation to watch the World Series, now we don't. We used to come together every morning as a nation to read the front page of the paper that was delivered to our door, and now in Portland, it's not delivered to our door at all 3 days a week. Generally, I think I'm a more positive person than Nigel, but don't we have to agree that the declining World Series ratings and the absence of a daily newspaper are major signs of a nation that's coming apart and basically going to hell in a handbasket?
You know, I might add, though, Steve, I don't know if the nation is any better served by a city council. I mean, what's happened to your personality, for example, since you joined the city council? Do you know how often I see a city council story now, especially involving our mayor, in which there's no comment? The mayor and his staff could not be reached for comment. You guys have become so painfully dull that I think that's what's hurting the fabric of this city and this nation.
Just so we don't end on a totally pessimistic note, I have to say, I have seen some fabulous young journalists come through our doors. These kids have incredible talent. Multimedia doesn't faze them at all. They have what we used to call the fire in the belly. They really want to do this. They want to go out there and be investigative journalists. They want to be good journalists. Some of them are actually finding jobs. We try to help them do that. And they give me hope, frankly, because they're also kind of entrepreneurial. They know how it works, and I think that they're going to stick with it. So I am optimistic in that regard, because we have seen some very talented young people who have been trained right here at the University of Oregon, journalism programs and other places, who have come through our doors and who are still out there working in the field today.
Excuse me. Louise Baudreau, member of City Club. I have had the experience of living for several years in Eastern Europe. This was before the walls came down. Every time I returned, I was so grateful, and I prayed and thankful to our press, our journalism. And I truly believe you are equal to our other three big government. So I am grateful. Now, to make it a question, when you have so much to choose from, how do you personally select what you're going to investigate? Thank you.
That's a great question. I get a lot of calls, and a lot of people want to tell you their life story, and I always want to say, tell me in elevator speech time what the story would be if everything you think is true, and then tell me whether you think I can prove it. Of course, I got to decide that myself. So it is a question of, is it news and can it be proven? And a lot of times people tell you things that sound remarkable, there's no way to ever prove, or a lot of times people tell you things that are simply not very interesting. So you just have to filter them.
And I can tell you that as an editor, and I'm the one who's often making the choices, I rely heavily on our reporters. We have a great healthcare reporter in Christian Fodenvenzel. He is generating stories all the time, and he knows the subject really well. Rob Manning, our education reporter, knows what's going on a deep level there. And we just have to set priorities and say, you know what? We're going to go down this path. We're going to ignore some of the things that are tempting, but because we know we can do a better job and get a little deeper in the story if we stick with this path, and if you go out and you do the research there and you ignore this other thing that's breaking today.
Kurt Wabering, member. Ballot measures. What's your perspective on them from an investigative journalist's point of view? Seems to me that sometimes very important issues are raised. Sometimes there are real questions about who is sponsoring it from wealthy out-of-state persons. Is this a good area for investigative journalism?
Yeah, no, it's an area I think we handle actually pretty well. I mean, it's incredibly rich. So much of public policy is driven by them now, but again, I think it's one of those things we generally do a great job doing.
Jeannie Magmer, City Club member. There's 36 counties, 200 school districts, and many more cities and other local governments. And in the days when the Oregonian reporters had money to burn, you had a reporter in every corner of the state, and if you didn't have a reporter, you had a stringer. And all of those governments were kind of kept on the straight and narrow. They didn't tend to violate the open meetings law because there was somebody there to watch them. You can't cover them all now. So what are you doing to make sure that our local governments are living up to the expectations that they should be living up to?
Not enough, but probably more than anyone else. There's still, the title of this afternoon presentation to me was a little disconcerting because it was sort of less news. Is that good news for Oregon? We still have 90 reporters at 1320 Southwest Broadway. No, we don't send them out to Harney County and Jackson County and Deschutes County as often as we'd like, but yeah, where do I go from there? Maybe we depend a little bit more on folks in this room to pay attention to what's going on there and let us know more than we used to.
And I would only add that we see ourselves as a statewide news service. Through the partnerships that I mentioned before, we do have reporters throughout the region. And this newspaper partnership that we've just started is a beginning point for us, and at least bringing forward the news stories from around the state. We have a pretty big megaphone at Oregon Public Broadcasting, and so we're now broadcasting stories that reporters from other newspapers, from smaller newspapers in some of those communities are reporting, and there's good journalism that's going on out at those local papers.
Sometimes when voters make questionable decisions or decisions that are hard for reporters to understand, I say, we get the government we deserve, because there's always a lot of information available, and if candidates who are lousy candidates get elected, the people made their choice. And I think on a macro basis, the people of this state and this country are making a choice, have made an involuntary choice, and that choice is to have less coverage. I don't think that's a terminal choice or a final choice. So yes, nobody's covering Jackson County, nobody's covering Harney County, perhaps the way they used to. The people in those communities that are undercovered will have to decide, is that the way they want to live? Do they want to live without knowing what happened at their city council meeting or at their school board meeting? And if they do, okay. I think to some degree we've seen that play out in the pages of the Oregonian as they've covered Curry County and other timber counties that don't have money for libraries or jail cells or schools or other basic services. You know, one of the very basic services a lot of communities rely on is somebody to tell them who won the basketball game last night. So I think it's a choice that people will have to make for themselves. It's not Peter Badia, who's here in the room, the executive editor of the Oregonians. It's not his, he is not required to cover those counties. If those people don't want to pay for the coverage, they're not going to get it, and it'll be their loss.
Unfortunately, we run out of broadcast time for further questions, and we'll have to stop for the day. Please join us next week to discuss the parallels between the Motor City and the City of Roses. As we close today, please join me in offering our sincere thanks to our guests, Steve Duin, Nigel Jaquiss, and Eve Epstein. Thank you very much.